I can't believe it's already been 5.5 years since I recorded my playthrough of what's probably the worst Czech game in history, Bloodline. This 2005 title from Zima Software was a marked departure from the studio's previous work. Or would you really expect the creators of the huge successfully adventure game Polda to try their hand at a first-person survival horror game? I certainly wouldn't have, but you know what? Bloodline doesn't look too bad on screenshots, but once you see it in motion, any hope for even an average game quickly plummets to zero. What do I remember most? Tons of bugs, the unfinished state, the overall disaster everywhere, that ridiculous ending, the lead programmer engineer Jiří H, and of course...
No tak ale pozor, musím ocenit fungující zrcadla, protože ani v roce 2020 spousta her nedělá fungující zrcadlo. Většinou ho rozbije, nebo prostě šedlí a nic nevidíte. A teď mě napadá... Ano.
Or, for example, that there's a pretty good chance you will softlock yourself before the end, leaving you no choice but to start over from the beginning. The positives? Definitely two. The Czech dubbing and the fact it didn't crash on me back then.
Rád bych řekl Ježíšek, ale nějak tomu nevěřím. A byl to zával.
And since it's New Year's Eve, this video was originally supposed to be in the vein of I kidnapped myself and under threat of extensive singing forced myself to play Bloodline again. But the more I developed this idea and started looking for reviews, previews or interviews, the more it became clear to me that it just didn't fit together at all. So I tossed the whole idea into the trash and decided to make a serious video on this topic instead. That's a very nice way to say you are embarrassed by me. I wrote this intro section sometime in mid-November and kind of figured I would meet a New Year's Eve deadline without any problems. I did write directly to Zima Software at the same time, but since today's studio shares only the name with the original one, I didn't really expect a reply. And I wasn't wrong. It did have one positive aspect though. In my infinite wisdom, I discovered that not all Martin Zimas are the same. The Czech game development studio Zima Software is very well known among Czech and Slovak gamers, but I'm not so sure how widely their most famous adventure game Polda has gained traction abroad. Of course, this wasn't the only title to fly out into the world from their Prague offices, but it must be acknowledged that it was undoubtedly the most famous and best-selling. The remaining attempts mostly ended the same way, with low ratings from reviewers, a lack of interest from players and low sales figures. Still, the studio didn't give up and kept trying again and again and again. Speaking of Polda, few people today realize that the creators of the first installment were not actually Zima Software, but the originally Prague-based Sleep team. Zima only handled the dubbing and distribution and didn't take the lead on development until the second installment, which Sleep team no longer wanted to be involved in. Our story begins sometime in early 1999 when Martin Zima, the head of Zima Software, released the first information on the Czech internet about a new project by Prague-based developers, DevTracer. It was supposed to be first-person 3D action game, and I have to admit that on paper at least it sounds interesting. In a near future steeped in cyberpunk, the player was to become a member of resistance group fighting against a massive corporation that controls the entire society. They promised plenty of twists in a truly cinematic story, communicating with other resistance members, various gear, weapons and even vehicles like a combat submarine or a bomber. There were even plans for various problem-solving approaches. As I'm writing this, I can't shake the feeling that I'm describing Deus Ex, which wasn't released until a year after the Czech DevTracer. Of course, most of it was just marketing hype, so let's fast forward a year to when game journalists visited the developers' offices. The Czech website BonusWeb had this opportunity in April 2000, and when I read the sentence after a few questions, I was a little disappointed right in the first paragraph. I had my doubts, and those fears were confirmed. After the usual recap of familiar facts, that is, Rebels vs. Corporation, cinematic story with 3 endings, and the development of a proprietary engine that was supposed to bring us as close as reality as possible, possible, including enemies' body parts that were supposed to fly everywhere upon being hit, came the first shocking revelation. The game's development was still in its infancy, which, considering that we had known about it for a year and it even appeared in Invex 1999, for example, was more than a little strange, especially since it was supposed to be released that same year. But really, the lead developer confirmed to visitors that intensive work had only begun about 3 months earlier. More detailed questions about the story didn't fare any better as no one was able to answer them. Add to that the fact that the development team wasn't working in one location, it didn't seem entirely credible. So what was really going on? In the late 90s, Zima Software decided to use the money earned from the first Polda game to launch several major projects at once. However, they didn't have enough developers, so they hired outside companies or individuals for some of them. But let's not forget that it was still the famous Czech wild 90s. The whole nation was buzzing about the victory in Nagano. Not that anything has changed in that regard nearly 30 years later, and Czech games were still in their infancy. After all, the world-famous Hidden and Dangerous wasn't released until July 1999. I'm specifically mentioning this World War II tactical shooter because when it comes to Czech games, I grew up playing this, not adventures like Polda, Horké léto or RPG Brany Skeldalu, and we still had to wait quite a while for the first Mafia or Vietkong, or of course, Operation Flashpoint. But I've got sidetracked. Less than a month had passed when BonusWeb via Zdeněk Polách reported on the company's potential financial problems. The focus was on the statement by Jan Halfar, the person responsible for 3D modeling of objects in the suspended Shock Killer project, who said that they hadn't been paid for their work, and instead of that, several developers were told they hadn't met expectations. But that's not possible since the people at Zima were continuously checking our work and, according to them, had been completely satisfied with it up until that point, Halfar said. Martin Zima understandably dismissed all these speculations, and production director Radek Smíšek commented on the situation by citing efforts to strengthen development on Deathtracer and Hearthros, which are important to us. Admittedly, this doesn't really make sense to me, given that Shock Killer was supposed to be in an advanced stage of development, and instead of finishing it, they shelved it for a year. But whatever, I'm making information systems for psychiatry, not video games. The actual status of the project was nothing like what was presented to the media. According to my informations, the development team at its largest consisted of 6 to 8 people, including 2 young programmers who were trying to cobble together a 3D game engine on the fly. The Opava-based company Fanatic Games, which at the time was also a 2-person team, was hired to handle the graphics. However, additional employees were hired very quickly to meet Zima Software demands, but none of them had much experience, practically not at all, so from today's perspective we would call them junior developers. What might be interesting to you, Fanatic is still in business and has since contributed to numerous Czech and international games. To name just a few: second Vietkong, second Assassin's Creed, third Arma, third Mafia, remaster of the first Mafia, World of Tanks or the second Kingdom Come Deliverance. This group of undoubtedly enthusiastic but desperately inexperienced people managed to put together only the bare minimum. The game engine was unusable for most of the development and couldn't even handle basics like character animations. The graphics were finished at most a quarter of the way. Level design? It probably didn't exist at all. And if the situation was similar with other projects, I assume that Zima Software's management very quickly came to the conclusion that things couldn't go on like this. Not paying for someone's work strikes me as rude though, to say at least, but God only knows what the truth was back then. After all, Zima hired Fanatic and Fanatic hired those graphic artists, so... well, probably would be better to move on. In any case, time proved Jan Halfar right, as a report surfaced in early August of the same year stating that development has been halted not only on Shock Killer but also on a strategy game Hearthros. Martin Zima chose not to comment publicly this time, but in a leaked internal communication to the developers, he confirmed that Zima Software was currently unable to finance Hearthros and that work was therefore being suspended until further notice. At that point, only 2 projects remained in development, Deathtracer and Polda 3, or at least those that had been officially presented to the public. But even that wasn't true 6 months later, as a new project, Bloodline, was unveiled, or rather, new one. It was actually rebranded Deathtracer, and it's highly questionable what, if anything, survived from the original concept. Gone was the cyberpunk setting, gone were the rebels, corporations, cinematic story with multiple endings, vehicles and who knows what else, because as the official press release stated, a dark, horror-filled setting and a suspenseful atmosphere accompany the main character, attorney Jim Card, through 4 chapters. Each chapter takes place in a different time period and location. Jim Card gradually uncovers the secrets of Dr. Brown's family, whom he encounters at the beginning of the game to defend him in a trial he is already destined to lose. What was really going on behind the doors at Zima Software at that time? What I'm going to say now will sound insanely melodramatic, but it's true. A savior arrived, screenwriter Josef Nemet. I assume he wouldn't call himself that, neither now nor back then, especially since in 2001 he was just a young up-and-coming screenwriter. However, no one can deny that he finally steered the development in some direction. He was handed a poster, a bunch of concept art, a brief plot description, and had to learn to swim very quickly. The earliest mention I was able to find dates back to the late November 2000, when a short introduction to the game by Michal Atzler appeared on the Czech website Dopje. The first details emerged about 4 chapters full with action and puzzles, wrapped up in a cinematic story with 3 different endings. The press release promised up to 300 shocking and unexpected moments, 40 types of enemies, and a few revealed weapons such as sickle, pickaxe, shotgun, light machine gun and a homemade flamethrower. Even at that time a great deal of emphasis was placed on graphics. Zima Software created its own graphics engine capable of producing high-resolution images and noted that all character animations were to be created using motion capture. The authors also briefly touched on the studio's financial problems, which I mentioned a moment ago and which were reportedly already resolved, as was ultimately confirmed at the Invex Expo show at that time. Basically, the same report appeared 3 months later on the same day on Games Tiscali, BonusWeb and the international site GameSpot. Let's focus for a moment on the international side, as 14 days later it published an interview with Radek Smíšek, the production manager, who revealed the first concrete details. The inspiration came from horror films like Hellraiser or Peter Jackson's Braindead, as well as Italian gore films. In each of the 4 chapters, the main antagonist is supposed to be a member of the Brown family clan, hence the title Bloodline, in order to break the family curse. While the first chapter took place in the sanatorium of the doctor who had been just arrested, the second was supposed to transport us to a concentration camp toward the end of World War II and the third to foggy London in the early 20th century. Enemies are supposed to differ from one another in their combat tactics and weaknesses. The emphasis will be on a more realistic approach to combat. There was even mention of a multiplayer mode, which is reportedly in development. The game is said to be in alpha testing phase at the moment and is scheduled for release by the end of 2002. Exactly on my 11th birthday, Zdeněk Polách, undoubtedly a very popular figure at Zima Software, wrote about Bloodline. In the very first paragraph he criticized the chaotic development of Death Tracer and praised the arrival of screenwriter Josef Nemet. Apparently every developer finally knows what they are working on, what the game will be about, what it will include, where it will take place, how it will work and how long it will be. And all it took, he said, was to come up with a finished script. Another interesting bombshell dropped a few sentences later. Polách claimed that there were no full-time programmers on the team. The game engine is being developed by 3 guys who come into the offices only 3 times a week. However, Martin Zima was quick to refute this. Of course, there are full-time programmers at Zima Software, but they work from home and come into the offices only for main and coordination meetings. Or to argue with colleagues. I mean to discuss everything the engine under development should be capable of. The entire article concluded with a huge prophecy. Bloodline is undoubtedly a game that definitely has a chance to succeed abroad, but if the engine contains bugs, is slow or forces the graphics team to lower the resolution simply because of how poorly it's programmed, Bloodline will have a very hard time. But as I was reading through all the remaining articles published in 2001, I very quickly noticed how they all follow the exact same structure: story, enemies, weapons, engine, sometimes music, when it will be released. That's it. So I guess I have no choice but to do the same. We never really learned much more about the story. The main character's name was repeated over and over, along with how he would defend Dr. Brown, that there would be 4 chapters, blah blah blah. Perhaps the most interesting thing in this regard is the mention that a boss fight was supposed to await you at the end of each chapter, and that several different endings were planned depending on how you handle them. Or that, for example, in the second chapter, the one set in the concentration camp, the Germans were experimenting with some kind of gas that could turn the tide of the war, and as luck would have it, there was a leak. We never learned anything more about the 4th chapter other than it would be a surprise. In interviews, the developers constantly referred to their goal of creating the scariest horror game possible and mentioned that, unlike the shooter genre, the PC market isn't yet so full of them. There were mentions of Resident Evil and Silent Hill floating around, and the developers, quite rightly to be honest, pointed out that there aren't many first-person horror games where you don't mow down hordes of enemies, but instead have to play more tactically and fear every encounter. Look, it's a 24-year-old claim, but back then it was really true. The enemies were supposed to be all kind of zombies in various stages of mutation. In a sanatorium they were supposed to be zombies right after mutating, meaning we want to eat you and that's all we know how to do. Later on, mutated zombies capable of thinking were supposed to appear, using tactics, hiding, cooperating, forming teams and so on. The combat system was supposed to focus primarily on tactics, using mainly melee weapons. About 20 to 25 weapons were promised, with a sickle, pickaxe, knife and bayonets being the most frequently mentioned. As for firearms, this included pistols, shotguns and an improvised flamethrower in the form of a kerosene lamp, and also Molotov cocktails. Each chapter was also supposed to have its own set, meaning Jim would start each one empty-handed. That multiplayer I mentioned, mostly all we heard was, well, we are focusing on single player right now, but we are not ruling it out, with the most detailed response speculating about a possible battle between zombies and mutants in arenas. Our engine supports multiplayer, both LAN and online. Speaking of the engine, it was actually developed in-house by Zima Software, and we later learned its name, the Death Tracer engine. So at least something survived. What was repeated over and over again was the maximum use of motion capture for literally every little thing, as well as the detailed rendering of enemies, including their facial expressions seen up close. There was supposed to be more than enough blood, and you were even supposed to be able to adjust its color, as well as the amount of flying guts and limbs. And while we never really learned much about it, the RPG elements were also frequently mentioned. The main focus was supposed to be on improving the player's combat skills, that is, becoming more precise and landing more damaging strikes over time, strikes that you were supposed to be able to fully control. This idea, like many others, ultimately ended up in the trash and was replaced by more adventure game style solutions. A different team worked on Bloodline than on Polda, consisting about 15 people, designers, screenwriter, 3D and 2D graphic artists, a musician and 5 programmers, plus beta testers. When it was supposed to come out, sometime in late 2002? But while the fourth Polda was actually released in February of that year, an almost uncomfortable silence settled around Bloodline. Gone were the interviews, gone were the screenshots, nothing. It wasn't until November that the game was finally mentioned again, when in an interview with Radek Smíšek and Jan Budín, which was otherwise focused on Polda, they said, "We hope Bloodline will be a hit. We are working very hard on Bloodline and we believe that it will show in the game. Or later, we have plenty of ideas, but we decided to successfully finish Bloodline first and then dive into the next big project." The year 2003 followed a similar pattern. The only thing worth mentioning is an interview in GameStar magazine where Michal Dřímalka stated that development was almost complete, but given everything that had happened since the initial concept, he felt as if 100 years had passed. Apparently they managed to achieve exactly what the developers set out to do. They wanted to create a game unlike anything else produced in the Czech Republic or abroad. Raw, gritty action, hand-to-hand combat. Nothing else happened aside from the release of a few screenshots, which journalists were quick to point out were mostly ones they had already seen before. However, player interest clearly hadn't run out, as Bloodline won Level magazine's preview on demand pool, so Martin Bach headed out for the January issue to chat with the developers, and apparently the AI was still being fine-tuned, but they promised us reaction based on smell, hearing, sight and courage during combat or when injured. For example, enemy will retreat, as well as pursuit, active player searching, patrolling, teaming up and attacks from both long and close range. The developers were working hard the whole time. Between us, those enemy reactions based on their senses weren't a marketing trick, but actually a mechanic that was intended at one point. Nothing scripted, everything happening in real time. But it didn't make it past the programmers, just like a lot of other ideas they weren't able to implement in more usable way. As Radek Smíšek said, imagine you are walking through a musty underground passageway, holding a flashlight that gives off only a faint glow. You hear various rustling sounds and a dripping of water. All sorts of insects are crawling along the walls. The music slowly begins to build. You expect something to jump out at you from the darkness at any moment, but nothing happens. Just when you think the area you are exploring is safe, you are ambushed by an enemy. The fear of the unknown, the unexpected, but also the fear of dangerous enemies that will be daily bread of Bloodline players. There was also mention of a brief collaboration with Zima Software, which involved using the Brno-based company's motion capture equipment. So in addition to their frenetic development work, the developers voluntarily endured that lovely 2-hour off-road adventure known at the time as the Czech highway called D1. I don't really envy them that. However, the collaboration ended very quickly as both sides had different opinions on how to proceed with development. The preview at least provided a few tidbits about the Czech localization, including the Planet Czech dubbing. Luděk Sobota was supposed to have time off this time around. The game is practically finished, so the development team has been reduced to 10 people. But nearly another year passed before we learned that Bloodline was actually finished. First, in September, screenwriter Josef Nemec stated in an interview for "Oh really, Czech gamer? That's awesome!" that it was finished and he wanted to thank everyone involved. And then again in early December when the message "We are done" appeared on the official website. Company Senega was set to publish it in the Czech Republic and the price was set at 799 Czech crowns. Bloodline was finally completed after a really long delay and was ready to delight all the eager gamers under the Christmas tree. The time has come to go through this one more time, and I really hope it also is the last time. But before that, I spent a good 2 hours trying to get Bloodline to run at a higher resolution than what's available in the menu, ideally in 4K. Just like last time, I downloaded the SUI fix. All I had to do was copy it to the exe file and I would be good to go, right? Nope. It wouldn't even start, so I tried looking at the source code to see if I could find any clues as to why, and I saw that it primarily searches in program files on my C drive, so I reinstalled Bloodline there, but it still didn't help. Okay, so I tried the DXVND wrapper. I got a little further, but still not very far. So I tried launching Process Monitor, setting the game to the highest possible resolution and figuring out where it saves the data. Aside from the fact that the game is constantly and frenetically searching the Windows registry, practically non-stop, I found a file, but it's encrypted and I really don't feel like messing with that. So, let's go nice and old school. I'm really brave, or maybe masochistic. The original version 1.0. And be glad you get to see it looking this good, because this is what I have to go through. And I really don't want to record it again, okay? So you get the Czech version. Važte si toho, co máte. Proboha, proč já to dělám toto? Nerozumím to. Strašný. To je hrozný. Tady mám celý monitor a tohle vidím. In any case, I'd like to say that the first 21 minutes of gameplay could be described as the ultimate Bloodline experience. I jumped in front of the mirror, discovered the console with cheats, stared at the loading screen for ages, went deaf from the loud music, and almost got killed by the first enemy. So I thought to myself, I'll try using those throwing knives and always pick them up from the corpses. And as soon as I tried to use the key on the gate, it disappeared from my inventory while the gate remained locked. So I ran around there for a while, with enemies respawning furiously, and when I finally died, there was of course no save. So I thought to myself, okay, I guess this will take me back to the menu. What can I say? The final result you are currently watching is absolutely tragic. Virtually nothing remains of the promises made in various interviews. Instead, we are left with this unplayable thing that calls itself a game. Actually, yes, a few things survived, at least Jim Card, Dr. Brown and the aforementioned sanatorium. And as you play through the game, you will find a few other references. For example, toward the end, you might come across an MP40 submachine gun. In short, a reference to the planned second chapter set in World War II. And I could probably go on like this. The rest was ruthlessly cut out, like in a Chinese lynch execution. Don't Google it, just don't. Actually, I would be pretty curious to see what Bloodline looked like, say, a year before release, when the developers kept insisting it was finished and they were just fine-tuning it. Tactical combat? Forget it. Examining enemies' facial expressions? Not a chance. Sophisticated AI? I must have accidentally turned it off. The only thing that zombies can do is walk toward you, unless you stand on a box or a table, in which case they will just stand there not knowing what to do. So they wait for you to stop being so mean to them, and to punish you they will respond right back after a few dozen seconds. The one honorable exception is that blob down in the lighthouse. Or maybe they are just invisible, that's great too. Vana. Vidíte to sami. Úžasné. Vana. Another great feature is the loading screens. Each one takes at least 2 minutes, so I always have plenty of time to take a good look at myself in the reflection of my monitor to wonder what the hell I'm doing with my free time. The internet does recommend moving all the textures to the Czech folder, since apparently the game searches for every little thing using a brute force scan every time it loads, but even though I did that, it didn't really help. And keep in mind that I have it on my SSD drive. I would rather not know what it would look like on a classic hard drive back then. I read in one review that it took 8 minutes to load. That honestly freaks me out a bit. So imagine that after finding the key to the cellar, the journey took an incredible 9.5 minutes, with loading screens taking 6.5. That's just what you want to experience. What's left of the story? Well, I'm Jim Card, the main villain is Dr. Brown, and it takes place in a sanatorium. Forget about the 4 chapters, the final boss is in the form of the Doctor's ancestors, various locations, different time periods and so on. All of that was left on the cutting room floor a long time ago. Not to mention that hard 180 degrees turn in the middle of the game, when the main character, who's been trying to escape the sanatorium the whole time, declares that it would be best to go back to stop it all. Or some of the dialogues.
Někdejší pracovník tohoto bohem zapomenutého místa.
Vy jste opravdu lékař?
Ano.
A few moments later.
Jste pacient?
Ne, a nikdy jsem nebyl. Jsem lékař, vědec.
And I would rather stay silent about the ending. At least they used the Nazis. Even the famous adventure game elements in this so-called action-adventure survival horror aren't implemented very intelligently. In short, you can tell this is a work of adventure game developers. Few examples. You have to turn on the light because otherwise the character can't see, even though you can. You have to read a piece of paper because otherwise the protagonist doesn't know.
Nemám důvod, proč bych tam lezl. Dopis je adresován manželce mrtvého. Jsem zvědav, co tam najdu.
You have to open the watch and look at it because otherwise you won't be able to leave the location. Which, by the way, is exactly what happened to me 5 years ago. I didn't look at that watch either.
Jo, hodinky se Co?
As a result, if you don't play by the book like I do, because I really don't have a slightest desire to bother with it any longer than is absolutely necessary, you'll have to get used to hearing the line "I still have something to do" at the end of the level.
Myslím, že musím ještě něco najít, než odsud odejdu. Myslím, že jsem zapomněl ještě něco udělat. Myslím, že musím ještě něco najít, než odsud odejdu.
Because the main character magically knows that, for example, the Stroker's fireproof gloves will be needed 3 hours later to handle a red-hot kettle. Although, if I had to go back there, I would just turn it off right away. Oh, and when I placed 5 letters into the cross in the tomb and was happy that I wouldn't have to lug them around anymore, one button magically reappeared in my inventory in the next location and never left me for the rest of the game, which means it was being annoying. Trying to find anything in that inventory, especially when the mouse speeds up, is insane. For example, when you want to grab some molotovs and some monster is quickly closing in on you. Technical implementation? Well, if you ignore the long loading times, it's a nightmare. The game's intro plays in regular Windows Media Player, if it plays at all. You can climb onto the roof. You can jump out of the map. There are invisible walls on the bridge. Outside, the render distance is so short that I felt like I'm in a black box. The blocked off exit amused me years ago.
Východ je zatarasený. Ty kokso, čím? Čím je ten východ zatarasený? Ale tam je konec mapy. Čím je... Hej, ale vážně. Východ je zatarasený. Mohli jste tam dát aspoň blbou bednu, abych tomu věřil. Ach jo.
But I found another box, like in the cave section. Under normal circumstances you would fall into the water, climb back up the ladder and use the hook and rope to lower yourself to the other side, no problem. But I discovered that if I jump straight into the water and touch the cave wall, I automatically teleport back up. Logically.
Posledně mi neřekl ani polovinu toho, co skutečně ví.
Or this magical scaffolding with no collision detection. Logically. There are countless bits of nonsense, half-finished elements and bugs like this on every map. Oh, and the sound design? Do I need to say more?
Naslouchající a toužící
And before you ask, you can't adjust the volume. No, nah, not possible. I thought the Czech dubbing was fine, but all those typos in the subtitles, not so much.
To mi prozatím stačí.
Zbytečná skromnost, Jimmy. Můžu ti nabídnout daleko víc. Konec trápení. Nechceš se usmířit.
S vámi nikdy.
Long story short, it's a big mess. Huge one. Catastrophic even.
Nebojte se, nechci vám ublížit.
Everything. The main problem with the development of Bloodline was exactly the same as the one they faced a few years earlier during the development of Death Tracer. It was basically still the same uncontrolled total chaos. Of course the developers were technically a bit more experienced and the arrival of a real screenwriter finally gave the whole thing at least some direction, but we all kind of know that this was just a too big bite to chew for a group of Prague-based developers. It was still above all the same bunch of young guys whose greatest strength was their unflagging enthusiasm. The basic concept was practically non-existent. No one knew what the game would look like, when and where it would take place, what would player do, what the combat would look like, or whenever there even would be any. Nothing. But the main thing was that they already told the public how awesome it was going to be. I would go so far as to say that if Josef Nemeth hadn't come along, Bloodline would never have been released. Even so, the entire project was thrown together in a rush with quite a few people coming and going, the ideas coming and going, depending on whatever happened to occur to someone and what the developers were actually capable of implementing. It almost feels to me as if you were trying to put together something made of Lego, Mega Bloks and Kobe, and it would have benefited from a few more years of development, which obviously wasn't possible at that point. In an interview with BonusWeb, Nemeth stated that he would have preferred to create Bloodline as a classic 2D adventure game, but he was outvoted. So obviously something less ambitious and technically demanding, something the developers wouldn't struggle with as much. Fewer locations, more vivid characters, a darker atmosphere and more complex story. Another comparison that comes to mind is GTA 3, where the developers also voted on whether to keep the camera from the previous installments or switch to the new third-person perspective. And we all know how that turned out. On the other hand, if there's one thing that will always be positive about Bloodline, it provided people with jobs. It gave them the opportunity to gain several years of experience, which they could then apply elsewhere. It probably comes as no surprise that the Czech reviews were along the same lines as mine now. I have to admit though that I was still relatively soft, because at the very least magazines like GameStar, Level and Score didn't leave a single stone unturned in their criticism of Zima Software. And that was even though the developers tried to salvage the situation with a readme file stating that at least the AI bugs and collisions with objects would be fixed soon. But as Ondřej Broukal from GameStar wrote, we don't really believe that. They would have to reprogram the whole game from scratch. Petr Bulíř in Level was undoubtedly the most brutal. He launched into his criticism right from the first sentence, and the terms like an exploration of this nonsense, an endless series of loosely connected screw-ups. The game didn't undergo any beta testing. Even if a patch came out fixing 50% of this mess, the Czech survival horror remained a pipe dream. There are 3 to 5 enemies over and over again, which is a punishment for lingering here too long. The pinnacle of non-logical and poor game design. A crazy way of using the inventory, and others. The final verdict says it all. By far the worst game you can currently buy in stores. There are other pieces of crap out there, but fortunately they don't take themselves seriously. At the completely opposite end of the spectrum was Petr Kolář from Doupě.cz. He was clearly enthusiastic, although every time he praised something he added the obligatory but, and in his text I found, for example, right from the very first moments of playing, I run into various inconsistencies that beta testing should have fixed, or, as I've already hinted, at the moment the game is more unplayable than anything else. You would think he would go along with the crowd of reviewers, but at the same time he was clearly thrilled by the gameplay. He said the story's conclusion is worth it and the graphics are amazing. He gave it a 6, noting that if the developers release the promised patch, it's an 8. Visible confusion. To this day I don't understand if he was just trolling or playing some lost version. And a funny tidbit to wrap things up. Pavel Forst from Bonusweb apparently copied his section on the story from some older preview, because talking at this point about Dr. Brown's defense and how the two of them chat about what happened at the sanatorium and how Jim lets himself to be hypnotized. He really couldn't have been serious. Everything like that was long gone. Sometime in mid-February 2005, a short demo of Bloodline appeared online, which had the Herculean task of convincing undecided potential buyers to purchase the game. Hádám, že bych si měl vlevo nahoře utřít ten prach na tom monitoru. A mám tam nějaký otisk, to je docela trapný. It includes the first 2 maps from the full game, and on the plus side the loading times were shorter, perhaps because of that. However, I didn't quite understand why the installed files included textures from about 12 other maps, but you know what, I'm not complaining, it was done in 10 minutes. English localization was never released. Fans, which I'm still surprised about that someone like that exists, created the one themselves a few years later, and surprisingly it even included voice acting. To be honest, translating the text itself isn't that big of a deal, you could easily do it yourself, look!
Moje hlava. Co se stalo? Proboha.
The promised patch mentioned in a few reviews never arrived. The development team fell apart almost immediately after release. Some left to work on other projects, while others stayed at Zima Software and worked on the 5th Polda game. The company then went silent for 9 long years and ended up in liquidation. Today's version shares only the name with the original and developer Petr Svoboda, now the studio's leading figure, but that's a whole different story. I might surprise some of you, but in a way I've actually changed my mind a little bit about Bloodline. Not that playing it a second time convinced me, definitely not. Unlike last time, I didn't hold back, and from the very start I went in expecting to be a pretty unplayable piece of shit, and that's exactly what I got. If I ever voluntarily play this a third time, send my way some help. So you are probably asking what the hell I'm trying to say. Well, when I read the developer statements from 2001, I realized that their vision actually sounds interesting. That original concept, as they initially presented it. I would be actually quite eager to play this version of Bloodline. The developers undoubtedly had ideas and often very interesting ones. The fact that they couldn't turn them into reality is another matter. Of course, I'm not trying to excuse the final product. It's unexcusable. I'm just trying to say that behind every major screw up there might be some good intentions. Or maybe I've completely lost my mind, who knows. Since I've played through the whole game again, I wouldn't be surprised at all. Before the video ends for good, here's one last tidbit. This wasn't originally supposed to be the ending. In fact, there was another chapter planned, this time the truly final one, featuring its own enemies set in a completely different place and time, supposedly in the darkest past. Unfortunately, it was still more or less in its infancy, and when the feared "we have to finish this now" moment came, the decision was made that it wouldn't make it to the final version. Come to think of it, Jim is currently a madman, locked up in a padded cell, being studied by the perhaps even crazier Dr. Brown and his band of assistants. Maybe next time, in the Bloodline remaster. Okay, I'm just kidding, but I would gladly contribute.
Mé sanatorium je plné podobných, stejně beznadějných případů. Pacient teď dostane své uklidňující prášky. Bylo toho na něj moc. Jen doufám, přátelé, že jste si vědomi toho, že peněžní prostředky, které poskytujete mému sanatoriu, jsou pro nás životně důležité, ale bohužel nedostačující. Půjdeme ke mně a ještě to probereme. Tímhle případem se dál nemusíte zabývat, kolegové. Já už se o něj postarám.